Today's presentation focuses on soil amendments and fertilizers. These topics cover a lot of ground, so let's get started. Healthy soil is the foundation of a successful garden. Weeds, diseases, pests, and poor fertility are just messages from nature that life is lacking in the soil. As gardeners, don't we face so many of these challenges? And Dr. Ingram tells us perhaps the answer is right below us, beneath our feet in the very soil that we stand on. In the past, 10-Minute University has provided many webinars as well as handouts, and there's a list of some of them that deal with soil. If today, after the presentation, you find increased interest or perhaps more questions, I would advise you to go ahead and look some of these up to answer some of those questions and increase your knowledge about soil. Remember, you've been told that this is a recorded session, so don't worry about trying to grab the links right now. You'll be able to get them at the recorded session in a couple of days and have time to look through them. Today's program does focus on the soil, and so our objectives, here's what we hope to present with you to be able to learn. First of all, what are soil amendments? What, when, and how to apply to your garden or landscape? Learn to make informed choices for the use of fertilizers and soil amendments. Learn how to recognize plant problems that can be caused by poor soil nutrients, and learn how to enhance plant growth with improved tilth using soil amendments. Well, what is healthy soil composed of? We've known for years the chemical properties that affect our soil, pH, the nutritional level of the plant, and trying to avoid harmful chemicals. We also understand that there's physical properties in the soil, but the structure is like how much it aerates and how much water it can contain and drain. These two we've known for a long time. Recently, we're finding out from research that there's a third pillar, and that is the biological properties that are inherent in the soil and what determines the health. Our session today, we will only have time for the chemical and the physical properties, but if we can incorporate the good cultural practices of these two, we can see that they will benefit and impact the biological properties as well. So let's get started with one of the chemical properties that we should consider, and that is the pH level. pH, of course, is a measure of the alkalinity or the acidity of a soil, with numbers from 0 indicating the highly acidic to 14 for the alkaline. Most of the soil we have ranges from around 4 to 10, but look at the area that the plants will grow in. Generally, our vegetable plants grow in a limited area of 6 to 6.8. And if we want to have some of the acid-loving plants like blueberries and rhodiots, they are more in the 4 to 5 pH level. So understanding pH and getting the right numbers is going to benefit our plants. Well, how do we find out what the pH is in our garden, and how do we get started? Is there a way to just look and say? Well, no. In fact, you have to get a soil test. Here you see the gardener has pulled back some of the debris on the top of the soil, dug down about to the root levels that the plants, and gathered a small sample, put it in a container, and is ready to head off to have it tested. Now, why does this person, the gardener, want to have the soil tested? Well, because the pH level impacts greatly on the plant's health. In fact, it has as much impact as you would worry about diseases or insects or drought or drainage. The pH influences the ability of the nutrients to be taken up into the plant. So the right range of pH makes it easier for the nutrients to be taken up. This is a good way to visualize it. Here are our numbers 6 to 8, which is about the area where we want to have our vegetable garden pH. And if you look and see the macronutrients, which are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, are in rich abundance there and available to the plants at that level. Notice if the acidity of the soil increases, or the pH gets too high, that the nitrogen, although it's still in the soil, is not accessible to the plant. Same with phosphorus and potassium. The level of pH determines whether that nutrient that is available to the plant. Interestingly enough, too, when you get down where the pH is very low or very high, you get some of these micronutrients that actually can become too high in level, taken up into the plant, and can be toxic to the plant. So the nutrients available to the plant are highly affected by the pH of your soil. Sometimes we look at our plants in the garden and say, oh my goodness, this must need some fertilizer. But in effect, actually, if we have the wrong pH, all the fertilizer in the world isn't going to make any change at all. It'll just build up in the soil. But the pH has essentially locked out the nutrients from being entered into the plant. So we need to get some soil tested. And how does that happen? Well, if you live in the Portland metro area, you can make yourself available to bring your samples to the 3 sessions that are sponsored by the Clackamas County Master Gardeners. And you can go onto this link from when you see the recorded version and check to see what the times and the places are for these 3 sessions. There are 2 in the spring and 1 in the fall. It's entirely free. We give you the pH level numbers as well as guidance and suggestions based on what it is you want to be growing. So let's consider that you want to put in some blueberries. We would advise you, if your soil is too alkaline, say you've got a number 6 level of the pH, that you need to start lowering the pH. You would do that by adding ammonium sulfate or elemental sulfur. You can see it's being put in here by the gardener in small amounts and being worked into the soil. Let's say you want to grow your vegetable gardens and you have a pH of 5.5. It's too low for your vegetable garden, so you would be advised to add some lime or calcium-rich materials. We note that the best way to amend your soil for pH is to consider the garden plot where before you put the plants in. Check the pH level. If it's appropriate, then you can plant. If it's not, take time to amend the soil. It's much easier and more effective before you put all plants in to reach the right pH. It's a little harder if you have to go back and try and correct with all the plants that are still there. When you try to amend the pH and change it, it is a very slow process. You can only use small amounts of the amendments that will change it, and it takes time with repeated offerings of that into the soil. Well, in addition to pH, we also should consider the nutrients that are in the soil. Are we able to look at the soil and tell whether we have the right nutrients or not? If not, how do we tell? Well, one of the ways, we can just look at the plants that are growing. We might be able to see some signs whether or not there's some deficiencies in the nutrition of the soil. The first step is to consider what you're looking at, and you want to monitor the plant. Look for stunted growth and the leaves that are yellowing. However, as you start looking at your plants, you need to determine whether you're going to be diagnosing a deficiency in the nutrients or whether it's a disease that's on your plant. And the way you do that is by looking at the symptoms. Are they biotic symptoms, that is, caused by living organisms? Then you might see things like eggs or cocoons or slimy leaves or a powdery coating. Generally, these are seen in locations around on the plant, but generally not covering the entire plant. However, if you see a plant that the whole plant appears stunted or unhealthy, that's probably could be caused by an abiotic or not living. That would be an environmental stress, or in this case, nutrition. So that's how we're going to start with by looking at is determine if it's a biotic symptom or abiotic. We know that there are nutrient levels that we need in their soil, and we do need to have the right amount. The macronutrients, or the major ones, are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The nitrogen is essential for plant development. It plays a fundamental role in the ability of the plant to metabolize and synthesize protein. Phosphorus stimulates root growth, and also it is a a prime influencer in your plant being able to flower and then produce fruit in the ways of tomatoes or squash you might be thinking of. Potassium is important as it helps the plant with disease resistance and helps the plant to regulate the water as it transports some of the nutrients and the reserves around in the plant. These again are the macronutrients, and they are essential for plant growth and good overall health of the plant. A lot of the times the soils, depending on where we live, may contain adequate amounts of these already just naturally. We have macronutrients and we also have micronutrients, so there are more of those. Some of these include iron, copper, manganese, zinc, boron, and calcium also. And these are needed in much smaller amounts, and they will as well may be likely already in the soil. Some areas around the country have excessive amounts of them. Thing to remember about adding nutrients to the soil is if they're not necessary, they can actually cause problems, deficiencies and imbalance that the plant takes up. So let's just quickly review the nutrients essential for successful growth are the major elements, and they are needed in generally higher amounts because the plant uses them a great deal. Some of them, like nitrogen, is water soluble and it leaches out with a lot of irrigation or rain, so it needs to be replenished. The minor elements are required in much smaller amounts. Regardless of minor or major, nutritional deficiency results in being susceptible to infection or disease and pests. Well, let's see if we can, by observation, tell if a plant has a nutritional deficiency. So here we have a plant where the lower leaves, or older leaves, are yellowing. This can indicate lack of nitrogen or not enough nitrogen that the plant is taking up. As far as phosphorus, the plants will look quite stunted and weak and won't mature very well. The leaves will appear, you see this dark purple or green, and it's usually the lower, older leaves that are affected first. That's a phosphorus deficiency. Potassium deficiency is a little hard to diagnose because it doesn't show up right away. Initially, you might see that the growth is just reduced. You might start to see some chlorosis and necrosis occurring in the older leaves, as well as some mottled and leaf burn at the edges. Here you see that it is still a healthy live midrib, but yet the edges of the plant show the chlorosis. So this is potassium deficiency. Now we get into some of the micronutrients, and here's a sulfur deficiency, which initially you could look and say, oh, is this nitrogen? No, remember nitrogen showed the lower, older leaves were yellow. With sulfur, it's the newer, younger leaves that show the yellow. Here you see it in this plant as well. The lower are still green, but the newer ones are the ones that are showing the deficiency of sulfur. Magnesium deficiency shows up this way. You see interveinal chlorosis with the midribs are still green. You might also see on an older leaf where you actually get some yellow or reddish purple on the margins. Magnesium deficiency. Iron deficiency shows a tremendous lot of chlorosis in the new leaves. It can actually bleach the whole leaf out. Very stunted growth with iron deficiency. With calcium deficiency, we quite often think about the blossom end rot on our tomato plants. We also see disformation of the leaves, quite often with the leaf tip. We get poor bud growth, and again, chlorosis among the leaf margins. Well, we've looked and determined that we've got some plants with problems. How do I improve the nutrient levels from my soil if I'm determining that these are nutrient problems? Before we think about putting something in, we have to recognize that so many of the symptoms are quite similar. While we can differentiate a little bit, the interveinal chlorosis is common among several of the deficiencies. So it's not time yet to go out and buy what we think we want to add because we don't know quite what is missing. So guess what? It's time for soil test again. This needs to be, when you're having the nutrients analyzed, this needs to be done at a commercial lab, a professional lab. They can give you accurate results and also provide some guidance on how to remedy that. Here is a link for you to determine where you can find some of the labs that serve in Oregon, and also some suggestions and guidance on getting your soil ready for testing. You'll find some kits are available perhaps in your garden store. These don't generally can provide as accurate results, and the main thing is they don't give you the recommendations for how to solve the problems and how to understand what's happening in your soil. So again, recommend professional soil testing for nutrient analysis. Well, once you get your analysis and your numbers and suggestions, then you need to look and say, well, what am I growing? Because different vegetables have different nutritional requirements. So the question is, how do I determine what I add? And do I want to have fertilizer or amendment? And do I want to do organic or synthetic? Well, let's answer the first question of fertilizers versus amendments. What's the difference? A fertilizer is a concentrated plant food. It contains only nutrients. The macronutrients are usually in large amounts. Those are the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and they provide a very rapid nutrition. A soil amendment is more for a physical property, and it's used to improve the soil structure. It may contain some limited nutrients, but it is largely for the soil conditioning. So we're going to use fertilizer because that's what we need. Now we have to decide, are we going to have inorganic or organic? The inorganic are often called commercial or synthetic fertilizers, although they are usually mined as they are occurring mineral deposits, but they have been manufactured and processed to provide the nutrients in specific amounts that can be taken up rapidly in the soil. Usually a bag of fertilizer will contain the three macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, in various ratios and strengths. You'll see the three numbers, and you'll know whether the level of concentration of each by those three numbers: nitrogen first, phosphorus second, and potassium third. These can be purchased in a granular or liquid or a slow release formula. Some of the examples might be ammonium nitrate, and ammonium sulfate, as well as superphosphate. Remember that the synthetic fertilizers basically are salts. They can accelerate plant growth very rapidly, but if your plant is over-fertilized, it can really create some problems. It becomes less robust when trying to fight off pests and other such stresses. So consider the needs of your plant. What do you prefer in terms of cost and environmental impact? Organic fertilizers, you may have recognized these: manures, compost, feather meal, or bone meal are just an example of some that you can use. They're called organic because they're derived directly from plant or animal sources. They will contain plant nutrients in a lower concentration than the inorganic, and the nutrients get released slower, which is beneficial if you want to build over long term a healthy soil environment. If you're trying to remedy a severe problem in your garden, you could use the inorganic because that is rapidly involves the remedy for the plant. But the organic are slower and will over time build up a reservoir in your environment that will be very healthy for the soil and for your plants. It also has less risk of a runoff into our lakes and streams. Let's compare the nutrient availability in both organic and inorganic. Organic fertilizers have the nutrients, but they only are released when the soil is warm and moist, and that's because they rely on organisms living in the soil to break it down, and they're not very active when it's cold. So the nutrients are released slower and than they are from the inorganic. This reduces the risk of leaching, but it does take time to supply the nutrients. Inorganic will give you plant-ready form immediately. It's concentrated, but it also has a risk of burning the plant, as well as the fact that the rapid release of the nutrients might leach deeply into the soil and be unavailable for the roots to access it. So you're going to put on some fertilizer. How to apply it? It depends where it is and what what your growing schedule is. If you haven't put anything in the soil yet and you want to fertilize the entire area, then a broadcast method where you're going to sprinkle the soil with fertilizer. You can do it by hand or use a spreader if you've got a larger area. You do this before you have any seeds that are going in the ground. One thing to remember, though, is there's already some seeds there, and those are probably weed seeds. And so when you're putting the fertilizer in, they're going to enjoy that as well and benefit. It's not a good way to put phosphorus in because phosphorus is immobile and does not generally move around in the soil. So it's a broadcast method isn't very effective. Well, let's say you're ready to sow your seeds and you want to put some fertilizer in. Banding is a good method. Here the gardener has established the furrows already, and she's done another furrow to the side where she's going to put the fertilizer. And that goes in there, and then about the row for the fertilizer should be about 3 inches deep, and then about 2 inches away from where you're going to plant the seeds. Then it's all covered up, and you've got the seeds and the fertilizer in and watered in well. And when those seeds start to grow, they've got ready access to some fertilizer. Perhaps you see as the season goes along that some of your plants aren't doing as well. You want to add some fertilizer. Side dressing is a good method. Here you can see she is putting some fertilizer in along the drip line, avoiding very carefully to not allow any onto the leaves or the stems or even onto the roots. Just scratch it in lightly. Here's a fourth method that can be used called foliar feeding. There's a water-soluble fertilizer that's put into this spray bottle, and the leaves are sprayed. Now, the leaf tissue can take up some of this fertilizer, but you can see that it can be very limiting by how much it can absorb. It's also a little more expensive way to fertilize. Well, here are some guidelines for fertilizing. You fertilize based on the needs of the soil. Clay soils require less fertilizer, generally have more organic matter, and don't allow to leach out as well. Sandy soils are more porous, and you may find you need to have more fertilizer. How often do you apply fertilizer? Typically, after the plant is well established, 4 to 6 weeks, maybe after that, another one application would be appropriate. Be careful not to over-fertilize. When you over-fertilize a plant, you get a sudden burst of growth in the plant above the ground, but the root system can't compete with that and keep up with it. And so you end up with an insufficient root system, which means that you don't get all the water and the nutrient supply brought up into the plant. And a poor root structure will also reduce the fruit production of your plant. Over-application of both inorganic and organic can lead to burning, and they both can stimulate leaf growth at the expense of fruiting. Continuing on, if you've purchased your fertilizer, read the label. Understand what the nutrient amounts are and how to apply it. If you're going to use a liquid fertilizer, be careful you're not putting it on newly planted seedlings. That can cause a root burn. Wait till the plant's got a little bit of establishment first. If you're using a granular fertilizer, then scratch it into the soil well and water deeply after you've applied it. Remember that while you're fertilizing your plants, you're also going to be fertilizing any weeds that are growing there. They will compete for those nutrients. So keep your plants as weed-free as possible. Look for signs of fertilizer need. Remember, it's pale leaves, slow growth, and low yields. Many of us like to put mulch around our plants, and if that's the case, you want to pull the mulch aside and add a side dressing of fertilizer, water it in well, and then replace the mulch. You've received some soil test guidelines, so follow carefully for optimum results. Many of us look around our yard and gardens and say, well, should I be fertilizing some of the trees and shrubs? We've talked about the vegetable gardens today, but maybe we need to look at what's growing in our yards. If it's a young tree that's not been in the ground very long, you put it in, it will need annual fertilization. So make sure there's a grass-free circle of 3 to 4 feet around the base of the plant and apply nitrogen. You might want to do this for at least 3 years. If you're going to put in some fertilizer, the time for that is important. Be sure that it's early spring and no later than 1st of August. If you fertilize late in the summer, you'll promote some late summer growth. And that's a kind of a soft growth that will not be able to tolerate. It'll be very vulnerable to being damaged in the winter time. If you have a lot of mature trees and shrubs, take a look at them. If they have good leaf color and the canopy's nice and dense, no need to fertilize. If you find those are lacking in color and density, if needed, then add some nitrogen. Well, here's some ways of thinking about what happens when we have too much or not enough of our fertilizer. Just looking at them, if we have too much nitrogen on our fruit crops like tomatoes and squash, we get a great looking plant and no fruit. If we do not provide the plant with nitrogen, if it's a corn crop, at the right time, then we're going to end up with poor crop, a poor ear production. But again, going back with too much nitrogen, if we're growing root crops, turnips, carrots, or parsnips, again, we're going to end up with nice green leaves and very small roots. Here's a good example of over-fertilization. Sad-looking plants. This pepper plant in a pot has been burned by too much fertilizer. Here's a blueberry bush, also burned with fertilizer. Of growing concern is the leaching of phosphorus from farms and gardens, where it leaches into the water system and then flows into lakes, resulting in a huge growth of algae that damages the living lake and all the people, all of the critters that are in the lake. Well, let's return to the 3 pillars of healthy soil. We've talked about the chemical properties. Now let's look at the physical properties. Well, again, where to start? What's going to improve my soil? How do I tell if I have good soil texture? Do I need to have a test? Not really. The best way to test about your soil, the health of your soil, is the use of a shovel in your eyes and your nose. If you look at this soil, this is nice and loose. You could feel it with your hands. It has a nice dark color. If you could smell it, it would have a fragrant, earthy smell, and we might even see signs of biological activity like earthworms. So if we want to have our soil start to look like this, we would add some soil amendments because they will improve the soil structure, increase the fertility, improve the drainage, enhance water retention, and prevent erosion. Soil amendments are quite often organic. The organic means that it comes from once living, now dead, decomposing plants and animals. It is often teeming with microbial life. And in fact, if you mix it into your soil and have a nice, rich, amended soil, the microorganisms have been predicted to be up to a quantity of 1 billion per teaspoon. That's amazing. Soils high in organic matter can retain moisture, they resist compaction, and they provide a reservoir for the nutrients to be there. Organic matter benefits by improving aeration, enhancing drainage. It can actually promote some root growth, and it boosts biological activity. That was the 3rd pillar, remember, of our healthy soil. And I would encourage you, if you're interested, to look into this soil food web. Remember the quote by Dr. Ingram at the first of the program. And this is a program that she has been working on for a number of years. And that is in all the little critters that live below the soil, the biological activity. So you might find it interesting to do some look into soil food web. If you're going to amend your soil, the goal is for your vegetable and flower beds, the ideal amount is 3 to 5%. Let's talk about some options for soil amendments that are organic. One is coconut coir. Now, this is from shredded coconuts that look like this. It kind of reminds you a little bit of peat moss, and we need to talk a little bit about peat moss because that is no longer recommended. The harvesting is environmentally damaging, and it's not a sustainable product anymore. So you may be able to substitute in small amounts, perhaps your container or your raised beds, the use of coconut coir because it will help with soaking up water helps the retain water as well as the nutrients. Here's one that we're all very familiar with. This is a time-honored soil amendment as well as partial fertilizer. Manure can increase water and the source of the nutrients. Some precautions to be aware of. Manure can contain pathogens and weed seeds and some disease, so it needs to be fully composted or sterilized. It's best to apply in the spring so that if it's a fall application, you run the risk of some water pollution and leaching off of some of that with the winter rains. But manure is a wonderful way to amend your soil. Another way that is becoming more and more popular is the use of worm castings or vermicompost. This is basically worm manure. And look at all the benefits of worm castings: nutrients, microbes, it improves aeration and water retention. Wonderful way, and you can actually do some of this in your own home or around in your garden, is worm castings. You may start to see this is a fairly new product out for a soil amendment called biochar, and it is the burning of a lot of biomass from forestry and agricultural products. It's burned in an absence or low oxygen, and it results in a really fine grain, porous and stable product that can increase your pH, but we're not sure about the nutrients. A lot of it would depend on what was the product with us that was burned, but it does hold nutrients and it prevents the loss of nutrients and also can prevent runoff and leaching, which is always a risk. This is one we all are quite familiar with, I'm sure, to some degree or other, and that was we like to recycle our kitchen wastes or the yard and garden wastes. If we compost them, with a nice way to add nutrients and improve our soil. In using compost, here's what you're hoping it will do: is improve water acceptance and storage, improves the aeration, and also has wonderful benefits for soil organisms. However, you need to recognize it's really not a fertilizer, it's an amendment, and so you may need to add more fertilizer. It is possible to put too much compost on, and it can be harmful. It'll actually stunt your plant growth, and you do run risks of water pollution. So if you're going to add compost, you want to think, have I got a new garden, nothing's in there yet, I can put 1 to 3 inches of compost in and mix it in. If it's an established garden, you need to have no more than a ½ inch each year. Sometimes compost has high levels of phosphorus, so if your soil tests start to show that, you need to stop using the compost for a while and grow a cover crop instead, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Be aware that manure-based compost can also have salts that can be to a level that'll be harmful. I think a good way to test your compost is to put a few pea seeds in, take a small amount and put some seeds in it and see how well it's growing when you've got it in a small amount of soil. And it'll tell you whether you've got some levels that are harmful or toxic. Assuming you have a good quality compost, create a bed, put it out on the compost. A cubic yard will cover about 300 square feet at about 1 inch depth. You're going to hear more and more that we are talking about no-till, because deep tilling destroys the soil structure and the microbial level of activity in your soils. So just work it in with a digging fork or a spade to lightly turn it over and mix it in. Perhaps you want to add some during the growing season. You can do that again using the side dressing technique. Be careful again to avoid putting it on leaves. Well, there are inorganic amendments as well, and these are usually from the mined minerals, and they've been pelted or pulverized. The main function of the inorganic ones are to improve your soil porosity and aeration, possibly moisture content too, as vermiculite will hold moisture, perlite adds porosity, and here's some other examples of inorganic materials. In addition, some of the inorganic amendments that have been mined are also fertilizers. The rock phosphate supplies phosphorus, and green sand supplies potassium. Both of these are expensive and should be used in limited amount, but they are amendments as well as fertilizers. Well, it's a lot of work to think about how you're going to amend your soil. Here's a nice way to think about amending and fertilizing your soil both at the same time. You've harvested your crop for the summer. Now, do you just let the ground lie empty or fallow? Or no, you can plant a cover crop. This is known as green manure or nature's fertilizer, and it's planted and grown specifically to be then tilled or dug into the soil, or perhaps just left on the soil surface to provide a mulch. But it is a nice way for gardeners to grow our own organic matter. Look at the many benefits of planting a cover crop. We plant ours in after we've harvested our summer crop, and it does a lot of good during the winter. It comes up in time to be a crop there that will protect the soil. It'll reduce erosion, decrease the compaction of the soil that occurs when all the winter rains land on it. It can help attract beneficial insects, and it can decrease the loss of nutrients, increase the soil aggregation. It'll add organic matter just by being put into the soil. It can improve mycorrhizal numbers. And depending on what you plant, if it's legumes, it'll actually add some nitrogen to your soil. If it's grasses, it might suppress the weeds well as suppressing nematodes. So it's a wonderful way to help your garden soil in the periods off season. Here you're going to see, we think about cover crops as covering a large acreage, but you can also just put them in your raised bed or just in small areas around in the garden, in between plants that are growing. And it's a wonderful way to protect. See this, here's the snow and the winter weather, and yet this raised bed is well protected by the cover crop. Depending on what you want the crop to do, it depends on what you want, what you'll pick. So we have planted a mixture. If you plant the grasses, those generally will germinate and come up faster, hopefully, than the weeds. And so it becomes a nice way to suppress weeds because it beat them to the sun. If you want to improve nitrogen, you could plant the legumes, and those are some samples you can do. And of course, those then become nitrogen fixers. If you're concerned about soil-borne pathogens or pests, the brassicas are nice because they kind of have a natural native pest control. So growing cover crops is an excellent way to provide both fertilizer and amendments. Now let's talk just a minute about the difference between mulch and soil amendments. Soil amendments are to be mixed into the soil with the function and the purpose of changing the soil properties. Mulch, on the other hand, is put on top of the soil, and the goal is that we're going to be able to suppress weeds from coming up through it and retain moisture. Look at this garden here. There won't be many weeds coming up, and because they're covered with the mulch, and the mulch will prevent the evaporation of moisture from the soil. So it'll protect the plants in several ways. Mulch does eventually break down over time, and when it does, it can add in smaller amounts. It can still add some nutritional qualities, provided it's an organic one. There are other mulches, such as inorganic, plastic or whatever, that also can be used to protect the soil, but they don't add any nutrients. Well, it is an ongoing process, as you can tell. It is adding amendments and fertilizer to improve your soil is not a once and done process. Poor soil doesn't improve just after one application. Annual soil tests are needed so you can monitor your soil health. Add organic matter and mulch to keep the plants growing strong, and adjust the chemical properties slowly over time. And that's where we're thinking of the pH and the nutrient levels, slowly over time. In conclusion, a healthy soil is the foundation for success. Consider the soil properties, physical, chemical, and biological, which we have addressed today. Use testing and observation of your plants. Incorporate appropriate amounts of organic matter, fertilizers, and cover crops. Aim to have optimal nutrient levels and strive for good soil tilth. And also think about don't treating your soil like dirt. Before we close, I want to just note that very soon there will be an opportunity for those of you living in around the Portland metropolitan area for attending a garden discovery day where there will be free soil testing. You can go on this site to get more information about it, but I will point out that one of the classes is about composting with garden debris and worm bins. So we talked about that today. If you're interested in learning more, look up Garden Discovery Day, March 9th. Here I have 3 pages of my resources, which show where I have gained my information for today's program. And again, as you get the recorded version, you can have time to peruse these and search more if you'd like. And that concludes the program. And we're going to go now to questions and answers.
Well, hi there.
There you are.
There were so many great questions coming in. And
yeah?
I want to thank you for that. That was very wide, very deep. And there were good questions that came in. I guess the first one that I really want to talk about is the coconut fiber. There was a lot of questions coming in. And one person was concerned, do they contain a lot of extra salts?
They can.
And if so, how should that be applied into the into your garden?
I think what I do is avoid the ones. I think the salt occurs from the processing. So you might want to find out, I'll do a little research to see if there are some listing of coconut coires that show low levels of salt. I don't know how you would tell it just by looking at it, but probably finding out which products do contain. Again, it's how it's processed, and so it would take individual research on that.
Yeah, and maybe you have to hydrate it and then thoroughly rinse it before, because if you don't know for sure, then rinsing it would be a good process. Maybe you could do that in a wheelbarrow and a hose, and then tipping that out. Great. This is a question that we don't hear a lot about. It's if a garden is lacking in inorganic material, and I don't know if this person has had their soil tested. I think that would be a good first step. But if it is lacking in inorganic, it has high compost, manure, and very inexpensive potting mix, what can be done to help get a more balanced soil?
Well, the inorganics are largely helping with porosity. So I'm not sure if she feels, obviously what the problem is there's too much organic matter that's been put in. You remember in the slide I talked about how much compost to put in, or organic matter should be 3 to 5%. This person seems to be describing a garden that has a higher percentage of that. They might want to just start bringing in some more soil to get the balance. I don't think inorganic amendments particularly are what we want in the way of adding, at least not the ones that I'm familiar with. It just sounds like they've added too much compost. So organic matter is wonderful, but you can't overdo it. Is that kind of where she was headed, where it was concerned about the organic matter?
That there was too much organic matter, and what should she be adding to her soil? I'm wondering if she could contact a test and a lab, and if that's something that they could evaluate for her, so that she knows, so she can quantify what she needs to add.
Absolutely. The commercial labs might be able to do that. I know they test for the nutrients, but they also might be able to say the high concentration. With the compost, if there's a lot of organic matter, we're going to end up with maybe high levels of phosphorus and potassium. So yeah, getting a lab to check it out would be good.
Yeah, and sometimes we inherit a garden, we move somewhere, and that's what we've got. So it's great to be aware of that and to work on that.
Right, and remember, if you've got some soil that's problematic, it takes time to turn it around. It doesn't happen overnight, not in one season. But a cover crop's a good way to start.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay, does watering with acidic chlorinated water affect the soil health, and does it affect the pH of the soil?
That's a good question. I would hope that the city water doesn't have such high levels of chlorine that it does, that it impacts it. We live on a farm and have a well, but I have lived where we have used city water and I've never noticed that. I suppose if you could taste the chlorine, that's an issue that you need to bring up. But I would not think that it would be enough that it would lower, and it would lower, no, chlorine. Help me out on this, Priscilla. Acidic or alkaline chlorine? I think it's acidic. I'd have to go back to my chart on
That's a good one.
the slides. Yeah.
Yeah, but a lot of us are on city water, so we
Yeah.
don't always control what's in our water.
Right. And again, if you're concerned, I would say a pH test fairly often. If we offer it 3 times a year, you've got a chance to get it there. And if you start to see a change without having done any other change to your soil, adding anything else, and you start to see a change in the pH, you might look to see if that's the case. Yeah.
Okay.
Again, soil testing.
Yes, yes, and at Grow an Extra Row, we do soil testing every other year, just because it's a good practice.
All right.
Okay, this one I wasn't quite sure of. It says, are there edible green manure plants that you can consume some, and which ones shouldn't you consume? So I guess this is about cover crops.
No, I'm thinking they're talking about the type of
Oh,
manure you're using, in which case, isn't that, am I listening to that wrong? Are there greens that you're growing in manure that you can eat?
are there edible green manure plants?
Oh, edible green. Oh, so green manure is the cover crops, yes. Edible. Well, it's not a cover crop if you're planting it to eat because you don't want to eat it. You want to leave it in the ground. So you noticed I listed the brassicas. I list all those the legumes, they were edible, some of them, and all the peas are, and certainly the brassicas are edible. So yes, but if you're using it as a cover crop, don't eat it. You want to till it back in or mow it at best. One thing I failed to mention about the cover crop is some years we've had a warm winter, and I found the cover crop, especially the clover, is blooming and goes to seed. And then guess what? I'm going to have clover year round. So it's important that you don't let your cover crop seed because then you've got it all the time. So we've actually put the mower out and mowed it down so we didn't have it. They weren't gone to seed. And so that's
And
important.
we just answered Mary Ann's question that just popped out. What do I do with the cover crop in the spring? Don't let it go to seed.
Don't let it go to seed and get it down back in the soil.
Mhm.
You can leave it as a mulch. You could kind of cover it up so that it no longer grows. It'll start to decompose and die. Or you can turn it under lightly and let it decompose. If you've got, especially the legumes, that's where you are going to get the nitrogen fixation is if that's turned under into the soil. So that's what we do, and then wait a few weeks for it can decompose, and then we can plant. So there's lots of ways of using the cover crop, but I wouldn't eat it.
And I think Chase has a good question here. Are the coconut fibers and the soil amendments that we're referencing here, are they all safe?
Safe in what way? Wait, they're
Um, are the
coconut.
soil amendments approved under produce safety and organic standards? I'm not sure about the organic standards, but everything that we recommend in this presentation is safe for people to
Yes,
do if they want to eat their crops, right?
right. The list of handouts that I gave you toward the beginning lists all the ones from Timoth University. Ours that was created for this webinar is right at the top, and it says organic soil amendments. And you can look at those and know that those have been approved from Oregon State University. So yes, they are approved. And there's more on that list than what I listed. They also talk about they do mention cocoa fiber. it talks about, because it's how it's processed. They talk about coffee grounds as well, which I did not mention, but I think a good reference is to download that handout that's entitled Organic Matter as Garden Soil Amendments. And you do have the link for that right at the top of that list.
Great. What about compost tea? We didn't talk too much about that. When to use it? Is it just in the spring? Can it be done, say, 3 weeks or 6 weeks after plants are, need to have a little bit more fertilizer?
I use compost tea. I use it generally in my plants in the greenhouse. I can make it a foliar spray, or I can put it on the ground if I do it, if I'm going to put it in my garden. There's ways of making it, you do need to be careful. The elements in it, they will degrade. So you're going to make it and use it. You don't let it sit around. Put it on, it can be a foliar spray or it can be on the ground. I think it's excellent. To me, I've never noticed any problem with using a compost tea.
Great. And how about fertilizers that perhaps were in the back of the garage, so they're several years old? What is the recommendation on using fertilizers that might be 5 years old?
No, I wouldn't be able to address that safely. I don't know. I don't know whether the degradation occurs, whether the concentration changes. I'd be inclined to not put it on something I really care about if it's that old.
Exactly. Yeah, if it's really old, then that can be taken to the Metro recycling center and taken care of. All right.
Any other questions?
I think we're doing really well. You covered so much, and our little and we've had Sherry answering lots of questions. So I think we are about done. Let's see if there's any more open questions.
I will say, in my research, while you're looking there,
Yes.
Stella, I found the research on this most fascinating, and I had a real challenge to try to narrow this down into a program for a 45-minute presentation. So if you are at all interested in how to improve the growth of your plants and the health of your soil, I recommend a lot of the resources that I used, and learning more about the biological properties of our soil, which is, like I say, that's kind of a new frontier that's opening up as far as research, and the impact is tremendous on the quality of our plants and the health of our soil.
Well, you know what? I have one more I have 2 questions here. One is, do you use a pH/moisture home monitor type system, and are they accurate?
Because we offer pH soil testing, I've never used that. I don't know. That would be like a litmus test, I think is what they're talking about.
Either the litmus test, or there are these ones that have probes that go in and you leave them in for a certain amount of time.
I've actually seen one of those and didn't get very good results. The advantage of coming to have your pH tested with especially the master gardeners is you're going to get the numbers, but you're also going to get a lot of good education on how to amend it and what you need to use. So
Okay.
that's one thing that just the test alone is lacking.
Okay. And then how soon before I want to plant my vegetable, and I guess they're vegetable starts or flower starts, does the compost need to be in the soil? How many weeks prior to? And they say that it's well decayed compost.
I would say maybe a couple of weeks. The same with manure. We're advised to plant in the spring. Again, don't put it in the fall, because all you end up doing is having the winter rains leach it out. So put it on a couple of weeks before you're going to plant.
Okay. Well, I think that we have answered a lot of questions today. Whoops, more have just popped into the open areas. Ah, someone asked if you can mail in the soil to be tested at our for our master gardeners, and that's an in-person thing. Remind us the dates when we can have free testing again.
March 9th, and that'll be in the Milwaukee Center. And you do need to bring the sample in, and it's really good if you can stick around. There's some classes and some displays, and then we've got time to test it and get the results back to you and talk with you about it. The second time is at the Spring Garden Fair, which is a very popular event here at the Clackamas County Fairgrounds, and that is the first weekend of May, May 4th and 5th. So those two are spring times when we will test your pH. Also in the fall, I believe it's the second weekend of October, and we will have, and that's a good time actually to get your soil tested because you can amend it and think about what you're going to do and have a little more time to do it.
Yeah, and another important thing is if you've got a large garden, you're probably going to amend the entire garden. So you take sort of a shovelful at various locations in that garden, put it all into one bag,
No,
and
no, 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 no. Put it all into one bag. You're testing, what you're doing is getting an average of the soil all around. No, no, if you've got beans over here and corn over here, or you've got strawberries over here, make them separate bags, Priscilla. Make them separate samples so that we really know what we're testing to say this is strawberries and this is corn over here. I'm sorry. We have had people do that, bring in a big bag and say, I've got a big garden and I've got it from all over the place. And we say, well, we can give you an average of what the pH, but we don't know. It can vary tremendously with what's happened to the soil. The pH can vary. So yes.
okay, maybe I was thinking more about a raised bed where there's a small
Oh,
raised bed.
well, it's a raised bed again, depending on how big it is. I don't know. I'd keep the soil separate from where I got it from. If it's a small raised bed, you're okay, but you don't want to mix them because you don't know if it's impacted. You're getting an average again.
Okay, well,
Sorry to
you
jump on
got the
about
dirt
that.
on dirt, Amelia, so we'll take your word for it on that one. All righty. That is definitely all the questions. Wow, there have been a lot of questions come in and answered by our helpers. Again, if you have any further questions, you're welcome to send them. If if you think about it later today, email us. And if you have a photo that, that you have a question about a plant, those help as well. And just send it to the 10-Minute University email address that is in your Zoom link.